Before we get started, I want to introduce the folks who will be sharing the content of this presentation. I am fortunate to be the moderator of this space. My name is Clara Waybright, and I work with Mennonite Central Committee in Washington, D.C. Here with me is Karen Bigelow from Bread for the World. She's a policy advisor. We have Elizabeth Chin-He Lee, Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice and Climate Justice Lead for United Methodist Women. We have Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, Senior Associate for Pan-African and Orthodox Faith Engagement, Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. And we have Chloe Noel, Faith Economy Ecology Project Coordinator at the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. I'm now going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to give a little bit more background before I hand it over to Karen, who will go first. We are presenting legislative asks connected to this theme of climate justice. As the largest historic contributor to climate change, the United States has unique responsibilities to this issue. We come at this issue as people of faith, bringing a domestic and an international ask. An ask, as a note for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a request for something you're asking Congress to do. These asks that we have worked on with many folks who come to EAD together every year, these asks are tangible ways that we can ask Congress to direct resources towards seeking climate justice, towards addressing climate change, and our disproportionate role in creating this problem. The goal of this presentation is to prepare all of you as advocates for the work that you'll be doing as you go into these meetings with your members of Congress. I'm going to start with the domestic ask, and I will hand that over first to Karen Bigelow. Karen.
Thanks so much for turning it over to me. As you all see in the documents that have been shared via EAD, our overarching ask is that we urge Congress to enact infrastructure and energy legislation that will promote climate, economic, gender, and racial justice to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy and commit to net zero climate pollution in electricity by 2030 and economy-wide by 2050. I'm now going to turn it over to Liz to then talk more about why this is so important.
Thank you, Karen. The first thing we want to address is why do we need to transition to a clean energy economy? And it includes net zero climate pollution and electricity by 2035 and economy-wide by 2050. First, fossil fuel emissions are the main source of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in the United States and worldwide. A recent study published in February of this year in Environmental Research determined that air pollution from fossil fuels kills nearly 1 in 5 people worldwide. This is exposure from fine particulate matter from burning fossil fuels, and it was responsible for 8.7 million deaths globally in 2018. In the United States, given the sin of structural racism, fossil fuel particularly impacts communities of color. And race, not poverty, is the strongest predictor of exposure to fossil fuel air pollution. In 46 states, communities of color are exposed to higher levels of air pollution than white communities, where African Americans, regardless of wealth, are exposed to 54% more air pollution than the population as a whole. The fossil fuels that you and I use to heat our homes, drive our cars, be on this event together, currently supply 80% of the energy needs in the United States. And that's 62% of electricity. The good news is that transitioning to renewable resources such as wind and solar power will reduce and ultimately end our reliance on these polluting energy sources of fossil fuels. Next slide. Climate scientists and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on 1.5 degrees Celsius have noted that it's critical to limit the planet's increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, reaching this ambitious goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035 and 2050 will help us ensure that this happens because our actions have oversized consequences. We're only 4% of the world's population, but we've produced 25% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. And exceeding the 1.5-degree limit will cause devastating consequences that are irreversible. Catastrophic damage to the climate, including surges in the frequency and severity of dangerous heat waves, droughts, and floods that lead to hundreds of millions of additional people into extreme poverty.
Thanks so much, Liz, for setting the stage on why clean energy is so essential during this time, especially from a climate justice lens. One of the overarching themes that we talked about was the need for equitable climate. And so for our first ask, we talk about the need that we equitably address climate change in the United States. And so for many of you, you all have seen in your own communities excuse me, you've all seen in your communities across the United States that there's devastating impacts. We've seen hurricanes, we've seen deep freezes in areas that aren't typically, known to have deep freezes, such as Texas earlier this year. We've seen different climate crises happen, such as wildfires. And at this point, we really want you to go to your members of Congress and talk about the stories that you've seen. How has your experience been impacted when it comes to climate change? Make your experience local. Talk about what's happening in your region. You don't have to be an expert when it comes to climate issues, but you can be an expert about what you've witnessed and experienced. And so go from that point, really make this experience personal as you talk about how your community and the community around you have been impacted by the climate crisis. Next slide. And so our second ask is that we need legislation that modernizes crumbling infrastructure and increases transportation efficiency and decarbonization while prioritizing racial, economic, and gender justice. And so what we find is that Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Latina communities are often more vulnerable to climate shocks due to crumbling infrastructure. Often the crumbling infrastructure is due to disinvestment in these communities, not having equitable investment in these communities over the years in comparison to predominantly white neighborhoods. And so often when these natural disasters or these climate shocks happen, these communities are often not in a position to be able to actually cope with the changes that happen. And what we've seen is that after a natural disaster, especially a natural disaster that may cause flooding, we'll see Latino, Indigenous, or African Americans actually stranded in some of their communities where they're not able to get across, bridges that may be flooded, that may cause them to be unable to get to their jobs, to make their livelihoods, or even to get access to basic necessities such as groceries. And so what we know is that any infrastructure bill that will happen in the future has to have good infrastructure that will offset disproportionate economic impacts of climate change on directly impacted communities. And not only is it important to consider the needs of these communities, but we also have to include these communities into the co-creation of any resilience planning that happens and infrastructure plans. They have to be a part of the implementation process, and they also have to be a part of the evaluation process because they know best what's happening in their communities. Next slide.
And our third ask is that we need legislation that not only embraces renewable energy, but also supports a just transition for disproportionately impacted workers and communities that does not increase economic inequities. So the great news is that the cost of renewable energy has drastically decreased over the years. Think about wind and solar that did not seem feasible 20 years ago. It's actually comparable, if not cheaper, than conventional energies such as nuclear and coal. The other thing is that when we're thinking about this transition, we must have jobs that are moving forward in addressing this crumbling infrastructure and also to ensure just transition. So what does that mean? This means that the job creation is essential, and that we must have deep investment, comprehensive job training, and support must be provided for fossil fuel energy workers, the surrounding communities. And we think about the tax base and all of that transition that's included, impacting communities that include fence line communities, those communities that are located near fossil fuel industries, pipelines, highly polluted roads and highways, with the air pollution from fossil fuel diesel-driven cars, which is more often located in Black, Indigenous communities of color and low-wealth communities. And in this process, we must ensure that they are receiving the health and economic benefits of the clean energy transition. These jobs should not be purely jobs that are providing a paycheck, but does not provide security. So we're advocating for livable wages, that it also counteracts job segregation by race and gender, and that there are training and skills development programs so that they can move into these new career paths. So these are our domestic asks, and we will now transition over to the international asks.
I will now.
Oh, I didn't know if you were going to go, Claire, or not, but I'm happy to go on unless you would like to add some comment at this point.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I am so grateful to my colleagues for all of what they have shared so much. It's very helpful to this discussion. We're now prepared to go to the international ask, and I get the great joy of just giving the opening, and then I'm going to go over to my colleague, Chloe. The international ask, well, we are urging Congress to provide funding for multilateral and bilateral environmental accounts for FY 2022. We are asking for the $2 billion for the Green Climate Fund and focusing on funding for the most impacted countries and communities. In many cases, these countries and communities are burdened by historic colonization and ongoing inequities. So why these accounts and why these programs? Well, these initiatives build climate resilience and preserve critical ecosystems while engaging communities most affected by climate change. There are many stories that could be told about this. You heard some of them in the domestic context, but we're also saying it in the global context. We can see some of these same kinds of stories that are being exhibited both domestically and globally. We're inviting you to name your story, whatever that may be, because we are reminded, as we said at the beginning, that as people of faith, we believe the US must stand alongside of these countries that will be most burdened by climate change, and especially communities most impacted in these countries. To do otherwise would only exacerbate existing inequities that stem from historic colonization and ongoing discrimination. And therefore, it is for this reason we ask that the US support this funding as an opportunity to meaningfully address the climate crisis and contribute to the global commitments of the Paris Agreement. We believe that this is a good time, a timely moment for us to engage in these initiatives. We, as the highest emitters and wealthiest countries like the United States, have a responsibility to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis in partnership with peoples and countries most impacted by supporting their leadership and adapting to changing conditions. So this is a partnership coming alongside together to address climate change with the resources that are available. We also want to speak into this moment about China, because there are questions about that. We understand that although China leads the world in overall greenhouse gas emissions, it is the United States that has the highest per capita emissions and is the largest historic emitter, as previously stated. But both China and the US both have a responsibility for climate action. And this is the case, we would say, all over the world. But China and US have a unique role to play in addressing climate change. Now it is my joy to turn it over to my colleague, Chloe, to speak about our first international ask.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much, Angelique, for setting the stage. Our first international ask is to contribute $2 billion for the Green Climate Fund. The GCF is the largest multilateral fund dedicated to funding prevention and response to climate-driven disasters in developing countries. It's dedicated to catalyze other sources of finance, including the global finance goal under the Paris Agreement. So the idea is that they put forward some funding and other sources of funding from development banks and other countries, and other aid agencies contribute money in order to put forth these types of projects. And the GCF projects prioritize women, girls, men, and boys from socially excluded and vulnerable countries, with special focus on women and girls, as we know that they are disproportionately impacted by climate change, often excluded from decision making, and yet central to their communities and to their families. The Green Climate Fund uses their monies to go towards 50% mitigation and 50% adaptation. And of the adaptation funding, priority is given to small island states, African countries, and least developed countries who experience the greatest amount of climate disasters and inequities and are least able to adapt and mitigate those activities. And the other 50% goes towards other developing countries. In 2014, the US donated, or I'm sorry, the US gave $3 billion as a pledge to the Green Climate Fund. And of that, only $1 billion was fulfilled under the Obama administration, and no money went to the Green Climate Fund in the past 4 years. So it is for this reason that we ask you, Congress, to fulfill the US commitment to the Green Climate Fund to assist the most climate vulnerable nations by appropriating the remaining $2 billion through the state and foreign operations budget process. We know that we have a responsibility to fulfill our pledge, and that we also have the responsibility to give more into the future. So this will be an important moment for Congress to make a positive, robust pledge that we can hopefully continue for the next 4 years. The second international ask, I will speak to the first part of it and then turn it over to my colleague Angelique again to speak to the bilateral funds. The second international ask is to support additional multilateral and bilateral funds that repair global relationships and engage in diplomatic partnerships while working to address our disproportionate contributions to climate change and addressing other environmental challenges. Multilateral funds are funds that many countries contribute for a common goal, and bilateral funds are funds coming just from the United States to developing countries as a form of assistance. In terms of multilateral funds, we are asking you to ask Congress to support the Global Environmental Facility, and it's consistently received bipartisan support. And the Global Environmental Facility serves as a financial mechanism for a number of multilateral environmental initiatives to support small-scale renewable energy projects, children's health, and biodiversity conservation. And we know how important energy access is for addressing poverty, maternal health, and education, access to healthcare. So these kinds of programs are really important for communities. And additionally, we would like you to support the Adaptation Fund. It's the United Nations Adaptation Fund, and it directs funding towards small-scale country-led projects, such as promoting agricultural resilience, addressing food insecurity, and helping coastal communities to respond to the threats of climate change. And this would be the United States' first time contributing to this fund, but it is also an important financial mechanism for the Paris Agreement. And now I will turn it over to Angelique to share the bilateral funds.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for sharing the first ask and even the beginning of the second one. Thank you so much. So we want to go to, again, the final international ask, which is to support additional multilateral and bilateral funds. that repair global relationships and engage in diplomatic partnerships while working to address our disproportionate contributions to climate change and addressing other environmental challenges. So the bilateral funds. The bilateral funds are an important mechanism for the United States to strengthen strategic country partnerships and to demonstrate goodwill to countries that are still in process of developing and are dealing with low income and middle income situations. The renewable energy under bilateral economic assistance is the request for $268.5 million. This program provides much needed energy access for the most economically impoverished communities in the world. And then finally, sustainable landscapes under bilateral economic assistance. The request is for $202.5 million. The Sustainable Landscape Program addresses rural poverty and sustainable land management while also incentivizing efforts to curb deforestation. These are our international asks, and we ask that you be advocates in this regard. So thank you so much. Over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks so much all for sharing your wisdom and expertise in this field.